It all started about 3 years after my ex and I broke up. We'd been together for 4 years, living in downtown Vancouver, and the split was messy. I thought I'd moved on, but little did I know what was coming. At first, it was just small things. I'd come home from work and notice that a book on my coffee table was slightly out of place, or that the throw pillows on my couch were arranged differently than how I'd left them. I brushed it off, thinking I was just being forgetful or that maybe I was more stressed at work than I realized. But then things started to escalate. I'd open my fridge to grab some leftovers, only to find that they were gone. I distinctly remembered having enough pad thai from Mainam for at least 2 more meals, but suddenly it had vanished. I started questioning my sanity, wondering if I'd eaten it in some sort of sleepwalking episode. One day I came home to find that my living room furniture had been rearranged. My beloved IKEA Poeng chair, which I always kept by the window overlooking English Bay, was now facing the TV. The coffee table had been moved to the other side of the room. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it all. Had someone broken in? But nothing was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. I called my best friend Sarah and asked her if she'd been in my apartment. She hadn't. I checked with my parents, who have a spare key for emergencies, but they hadn't visited in months. I even asked my landlord if maintenance had been in, but he assured me they hadn't. The incidents continued, becoming more frequent and more noticeable. I'd find dishes in my sink that I didn't remember using. The shower curtain would be damp when I got home from work, even though I always left it open to dry. My toothbrush would be in a different spot on the counter. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I'd double and triple check everything before leaving for work, taking photos of how I left things, only to come home and find subtle changes. I became paranoid, jumping at every little sound in my apartment. One night, I woke up to the sound of my closet door creaking. I lay there, heart pounding, too terrified to move. I convinced myself it was just the wind or the building settling, but I barely slept that night. The next morning, I noticed that some of my clothes were slightly out of order. A sweater I rarely wore was now at the front of my closet. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized someone had definitely been in my apartment while I slept. I decided to confide in my coworker, Mike, about what was happening. He listened patiently as I poured out my fears and suspicions. When I finished, he gently suggested that maybe I should consider talking to a therapist. He thought that perhaps the stress of my job and lingering issues from my breakup were causing me to imagine things. Part of me wanted to believe him. It seemed more plausible than the alternative, that someone was repeatedly breaking into my apartment just to move things around. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I started taking extra precautions. I changed the locks on my apartment door, even though the landlord wasn't happy about it. I bought a small safe for my valuables and important documents. I even considered getting a dog for added security, but my building didn't allow pets. Despite these measures, the strange occurrences continued. I'd find my laptop open when I was sure I'd closed it. The TV would be on a different channel than I remembered leaving it. Once, I even found a half-eaten apple in the trash that I knew I hadn't put there. I'm allergic to apples. I started spending less time at home, staying late at work or hanging out at cafes until they closed. I dreaded going back to my apartment, never knowing what I might find. My friends started to notice that something was off. I became jumpy and distracted, constantly checking my phone and looking over my shoulder. Sarah suggested I stay with her for a while, but I was reluctant to leave my apartment unattended. What if whoever was doing this decided to escalate things in my absence? Then came the incident that changed everything. I came home one evening after a long day at work, exhausted and on edge as usual. As I walked into my bedroom, something on my nightstand caught my eye. It was a framed photo that I didn't recognize at first glance. When I picked it up, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of my ex and me, taken during a trip to Whistler early in our relationship. We were smiling, arms around each other, with the snow-capped mountains in the background. I remembered that day vividly. It was one of the happiest times in our relationship before things started to fall apart. But here's the thing. I didn't own this photo anymore. After our breakup, I'd gotten rid of all our pictures together. I'd deleted them from my phone and social media and thrown away any physical copies. There was no way this photo should have been in my apartment. That's when it hit me. All the strange occurrences, the moved items, the disappearing food, it had to be my ex. Somehow, she'd been getting into my apartment. The realization made me feel sick to my stomach. I spent the next few hours in a panic, pacing back and forth, trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront her? Call the police? I felt violated, knowing that she'd been in my space, touching my things, maybe even watching me sleep. In the end, I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next day, I went to a local electronics store and bought a set of small, discreet security cameras. I spent the evening setting them up around my apartment, hiding them in plants, on bookshelves, and in corners where they wouldn't be easily noticed. For the next week, I lived on edge, constantly aware of the cameras recording my every move. It felt invasive, but I knew it was necessary. I checked the footage obsessively every day, but for several days, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Then, on the 7th night, I got the proof I needed. The camera in my living room captured a figure entering my apartment just after midnight. Even in the dim light, I could clearly see it was my ex. She moved through my space with eerie familiarity, rearranging items on my shelves, opening my fridge, and even sitting on my couch for a while, just staring into space. I felt a mix of vindication and terror as I watched the footage. Part of me was relieved to know I wasn't going crazy, but the reality of the situation was far worse than I had imagined. How long had this been going on? What was her endgame? With evidence in hand, I went to the police. They took my statement and reviewed the footage, agreeing that it was a clear case of breaking and entering. They advised me to change my locks immediately and said they would investigate further. I didn't wait for the landlord this time. I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed that same day. I also installed a new high-security deadbolt for good measure. The locksmith noticed my nervous demeanor and asked if everything was okay. I gave him a vague answer about recent break-ins in the neighborhood. That night, I stayed with Sarah. I couldn't bear the thought of being in my apartment, knowing that my ex had violated my space so many times. Sarah was supportive, but clearly worried about my mental state. She suggested I consider moving, but the thought of leaving my home because of this felt like letting my ex win. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and paranoia. I took time off work, unable to concentrate on anything but the situation at hand. The police managed to track down my ex and bring her in for questioning. Apparently, she had kept a copy of my key from when we lived together and had been entering my apartment regularly for months. When confronted with the evidence, she broke down and confessed. Her reasons were a mix of unresolved feelings, jealousy, and a misguided attempt to still be part of my life. She claimed she never meant to hurt, but the damage was done. The legal process that followed was draining. I had to get a restraining order against her, which felt surreal given how close we once were. The court proceedings brought up a lot of painful memories and emotions I thought I had dealt with long ago. In the aftermath, I struggled to feel safe in my own home. Every creak and shadow made me jump. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks multiple times a day. The security cameras, which I had initially installed to catch my ex, became a source of comfort. I would review the footage each morning, reassuring myself that no one had entered during the night. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time. I'm rediscovering the joy in simple things, cooking a meal in my kitchen, reading a book on my couch, inviting friends over for game night. My apartment is becoming a home again, filled with new memories and positive energy. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm stronger for having gone through this. If sharing my story helps even one person feel less alone or encourages them to seek help, then some good will have come from this ordeal. After a rough breakup with my ex-girlfriend Sarah, I decided it was time for a fresh start. Denver seemed like the perfect place. Far enough from my hometown of Chicago to feel like a new chapter, but still within driving distance if I needed to visit family. I'd always loved the idea of living near the mountains, and the vibrant city culture appealed to me. So, with a mix of excitement and nervousness, I packed up my life and made the move. At first, everything was great. I found a cozy apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood close enough to downtown that I could walk to work at my new job in a tech startup. The area was full of cool cafes, quirky bookstores, and lively bars. I was making new friends, exploring the city, and finally feeling like I was moving on from my past relationship. But about 3 months after I settled in, things started to get weird. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was walking home from a late night at the office. The streets were quiet, with just a few people out and about. As I turned onto my block, I heard a car engine revving behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just someone in a hurry. The car slowed down as it passed me, and out of the corner of my eye I caught a glimpse of a familiar silver Volkswagen Jetta. My heart skipped a beat. It looked exactly like Sarah's car. But that was impossible, right? She was back in Chicago, over 900 miles away. I must have been seeing things. I quickened my pace, eager to get home and shake off the unsettling feeling. As I fumbled for my keys at the front door, I heard the car circle back around the block. This time, it slowed to a crawl right in front of my building. I forced myself not to look, rushed inside, and locked the door behind me. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Lots of people drive silver Jettas. I was probably just on edge from working too much and not sleeping enough. But deep down, a nagging worry started to grow. That Friday, I met up with some coworkers for happy hour at a bar on Larimer Street. We had a great time, and I was feeling relaxed and happy as I walked home around 10 p.m. The streets were busy with the weekend crowd, and I felt safe in the bustling atmosphere. But as I crossed 20th Street, I heard that familiar engine sound again. This time, I couldn't help but look. The silver Jetta cruised past slowly, and I locked eyes with the driver. It was Sarah. She was staring right at me with this eerie, fixed smile. I froze in place, my mind reeling. What was she doing here? How did she know where I'd be? The car sped up and disappeared around a corner before I could fully process what I'd seen. I stood there on the sidewalk, my heart pounding. A group of friends passed by, laughing and chatting, completely oblivious to the shock I had just experienced. I shook myself out of my daze and practically ran the rest of the way home. Once inside, I paced my apartment, trying to make sense of what was happening. Should I call the police? But what would I tell them? That my ex-girlfriend, who lived in another state, drove by me on a public street. It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head. I considered calling Sarah directly to confront her, but the thought of hearing her voice made me feel sick. I barely slept that night, jumping at every car sound outside my window. The next morning, I decided to change up my routine. Instead of my usual walk to work, I took an Uber. I varied my route home, sometimes taking the long way around, other times cutting through alleyways and side streets. But it didn't matter. Every evening for the next week, I spotted that silver Jetta. Sometimes it would speed by, other times it would crawl along beside me for a block or two. Each time, Sarah was there with that same unnerving smile. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, avoiding windows, and jumping at shadows. My coworkers noticed the change in my behavior, but I brushed off their concerns. How could I explain what was happening without sounding crazy? Things escalated the following Tuesday. I had stayed late at the office, not leaving until almost midnight. The streets were nearly empty as I walked home, and I felt exposed and vulnerable. I heard the Jetta before I saw it, the engine purring as it approached from behind. This time, instead of driving past, it pulled up right next to me and stopped. My whole body tensed, ready to run, but before I could move, the passenger window rolled down. Sarah leaned across the seat, that creepy smile still plastered on her face. She didn't say a word, just stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Then she tossed something out the window at my feet and sped off, tires screeching. With shaking hands, I picked up the object. It was a small cloth bag, tied with a ribbon. Inside, I found a stack of old love letters I'd written to Sarah during our relationship. Letters I thought I'd thrown away years ago. Scrawled on the back of one in Sarah's handwriting were the words, "You can't escape our love." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just some misunderstanding or coincidence. Sarah was stalking me, and she wasn't going to stop on her own. I spent the rest of the night researching stalking laws and gathering evidence. I wrote down every incident I could remember, with dates and times. I installed a security camera app on my phone, ready to record if I saw her again. The next day, I went to the Denver Police Department to file a report. The officer I spoke to was sympathetic, but explained that they needed more concrete evidence to take action. They advised me to keep a detailed log of all incidents and to call 911 if I ever felt in immediate danger. Frustrated but determined, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I reached out to some friends back in Chicago and asked them to do some digging. It turned out Sarah had quit her job and told her family she was going on a road trip to find herself. No one had heard from her in weeks. Armed with this information, I hired a private investigator. It took some time, but they were able to confirm that Sarah had indeed moved to Denver. She was renting a room in a house just a few miles from my apartment. The PI also found out she'd been using fake social media accounts to track my movements and figure out my routine. Knowing she was so close made me feel even more unsafe. I started varying my schedule even more, sometimes staying with friends or working from coffee shops instead of going home. I installed new locks and a security system in my apartment. I even considered moving again. But the thought of uprooting my life once more was too overwhelming. The final straw came about a month later. I woke up one morning to find a note slipped under my door. It read, "If I can't have you, no one will. We'll be together soon, one way or another." The threat was clear and it chilled me to my core. I immediately called the police. This time, with the note as evidence and my detailed log of incidents, they took the situation seriously. They increased patrols in my neighborhood and advised me on getting a restraining order. The legal process was long and draining. I had to face Sarah in court, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Seeing her there, still with that unsettling smile, brought back all the fear and anxiety of the past months. But I stood my ground and told my story. In the end, the judge granted a permanent restraining order. Sarah was ordered to stay at least 100 yards away from me, my home, and my workplace. She was also prohibited from contacting me in any way, including through social media or third parties. The police escorted Sarah back to her rented room to collect her things, and she was ordered to leave Denver. I later found out she returned to Chicago, where she was required to undergo psychiatric evaluation and counseling. It's been several months since the court hearing, and I haven't seen or heard from Sarah since. The silver Jetta no longer haunts my streets, but the experience has left its mark on me. I'm more cautious now, always aware of my surroundings. I've strengthened my relationships with friends and coworkers, knowing that a strong support system is crucial. I'm slowly reclaiming my life in Denver, determined not to let fear dictate my choices. I'm back to exploring the city, trying new restaurants and hiking in the nearby mountains. But I'll never take my safety for granted again. I hope sharing my story might help others recognize the signs of stalking and seek help before things escalate. I never thought I'd find myself living in Savannah, Georgia, but life has a funny way of surprising you. After graduating from college in Boston, I landed a job at a small but growing tech company that had recently opened an office in this historic southern city. The opportunity to be part of a startup while living in a place known for its beauty and charm was too good to pass up. At first, everything was picture perfect. I found a cute apartment in a renovated Victorian house near Forsyth Park. My daily walks to work took me past Spanish moss-draped oak trees and antebellum mansions. The slower pace of life was a welcome change from the hustle of the Northeast, and I quickly fell in love with Savannah's quirky blend of history and modernity. I settled into a routine, making friends with my coworkers and exploring the city's vibrant food scene. Weekends were spent wandering through the squares, browsing the shops on Broughton Street, or taking day trips to Tybee Island. Life felt good, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. About 6 months into my Savannah adventure, I started dating Alex. We met at a local coffee shop, bonding over our shared love of true crime podcasts and obscure indie bands. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. Our relationship progressed quickly, and soon we were spending most of our free time together. Looking back, there were red flags I should have noticed. Alex always wanted to know where I was and who I was with. He'd get upset if I didn't respond to his texts right away. He had strong opinions about my friends and often tried to discourage me from spending time with them. But I was caught up in the excitement of a new relationship and brushed off these concerns as simple signs of his affection. After about 8 months of dating, I started to feel suffocated. Alex's behavior had become increasingly controlling, and I realized I wasn't happy anymore. When I tried to talk to him about it, he became defensive and manipulative, making me feel guilty for having doubts. It took all my courage, but I finally ended the relationship. At first, Alex seemed to accept the breakup. He was sad, but said he understood and wanted to remain friends. I was relieved, thinking we could move on amicably, but that relief was short-lived. It started with small things. I'd notice objects in my apartment slightly out of place, or find items I thought I'd lost suddenly reappearing. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness, assuming I was just more scattered than usual due to the stress of the breakup. Then came the emails. I started receiving messages from unfamiliar addresses, each one describing in detail what I had done that day. At first they were vague enough that I thought they might be spam or some sort of prank. But as the days went on, the emails became more specific and unsettling. One day, I received an email that listed everything I'd eaten for lunch at a small cafe on Bull Street, right down to the type of tea I'd ordered. Another described the exact outfit I'd worn to work, including the color of my socks. The most chilling part was that these emails always arrived just hours after the events they described. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe someone I knew was playing an elaborate, if misguided, joke. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. The situation escalated when I started receiving text messages from unknown numbers. Like the emails, these messages detailed my daily activities with frightening accuracy. One afternoon, while having coffee with a coworker at Foxy Loxy Cafe, I received a text describing our conversation, including things my coworker had said just moments before. Panic started to set in. I felt like I was losing control of my life, like every move I made was being watched and recorded. I started changing my routines, taking different routes to work, and avoiding my favorite spots around town. But it didn't seem to matter. The messages kept coming, always knowing exactly where I was and what I was doing. The final straw came when I started receiving photos. The first one showed me walking out of my apartment building, time-stamped just minutes after I'd left for work. Another captured me having dinner with friends at the Gray, a popular restaurant downtown. The most terrifying was a nighttime shot of me through my bedroom window, clearly taken from the street outside my apartment. I knew I couldn't handle this on my own anymore. With shaking hands, I called the police and reported what was happening. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but explained that without concrete evidence of who was behind the stalking, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to document everything and to consider installing security cameras. Feeling frustrated and scared, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I reached out to a private investigator recommended by a friend. The PI, a no-nonsense woman named Maria, listened to my story without judgment and immediately got to work. Maria's first step was to do a thorough sweep of my apartment and car for any hidden cameras or tracking devices. To my horror, she found several tiny cameras hidden in smoke detectors and air vents, and a GPS tracker magnetically attached to the underside of my car. The realization that someone had been inside my home, violating my privacy so completely, made me feel sick. Next, Maria worked on tracing the source of the emails and text messages. It took some time and technical wizardry I didn't quite understand, but she eventually linked them all back to a series of burner phones and public Wi-Fi hotspots around Savannah. The person behind this was clearly tech-savvy and careful about covering their tracks. As Maria dug deep, a pattern started to emerge. The locations where the burner phones had been activated and where the Wi-Fi had been accessed formed a rough circle around my usual haunts. My apartment, my office, my favorite cafes and bars. It was clear that whoever was doing this had intimate knowledge of my routines and movements. Deep down, I think I knew it was Alex all along, but I didn't want to believe it. How could someone I had cared for, someone I thought I knew, do something so invasive and cruel? But as the evidence piled up, it became impossible to deny. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Maria managed to access footage from a security camera near one of the Wi-Fi hotspots frequently used to send me messages. The grainy video clearly showed Alex, hunched over a laptop, typing furiously. My blood ran cold as I watched him, his face a mask of concentration as he invaded my life. Armed with this evidence, I went back to the police. This time, they took my case seriously. They obtained warrants to search Alex's home and devices, uncovering a trove of information about me. Photos, videos, detailed logs of my daily activities, and even a map of Savannah with all my frequent locations marked. The level of obsession and planning that had gone into Alex's surveillance was staggering. He had created a complex network of cameras around the city, focusing on places he knew I often visited. He had hacked into my phone and computer, gaining access to my emails, social media accounts, and even my banking information. The scope of the invasion was far beyond anything I had imagined. As the police built their case, I learned more about the extent of Alex's stalking. He had quit his job months ago, dedicating all his time to following me. He had rented an apartment with a view of my building, set up elaborate monitoring systems, and even befriended some of my co-workers under false pretenses to gather more information about me. The legal process that followed was long and draining. I had to recount my experiences multiple times, each retelling bringing back the fear and violation I had felt. Facing Alex in court was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Seeing him there still so fixated on me made my skin crawl. In the end, Alex was convicted on multiple charges related to stalking, harassment, and invasion of privacy. The judge handed down a sentence that included jail time and mandatory psychiatric treatment. A permanent restraining order was put in place, prohibiting Alex from coming anywhere near me or contacting me in any way once he's released. The aftermath of this experience has been challenging. Even with Alex behind bars, I still struggle with feelings of vulnerability and paranoia. I've moved to a new apartment in a secure building, changed my phone number and email addresses, and become much more cautious about my online presence. Therapy has been helping me process the trauma and rebuild my sense of safety. Slowly, but surely, I'm reclaiming my life in Savannah. The city that once felt like a dream come true had turned into a nightmare, but I'm determined not to let Alex's actions drive me away from a place I have grown to love. I'm rediscovering my favorite spots around town, making new friends, and creating new routines. This experience has taught me the importance of trusting my instincts and not ignoring red flags in relationships. It's also shown me the strength of the human spirit. My own resilience surprised me, and the support I received from friends, co-workers, and even strangers has been incredible. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time. Savannah's beauty is still here, waiting to be appreciated. The Spanish moss still sways in the breeze, the azaleas still bloom in spring, and the river still flows peacefully. And now, finally, I can enjoy it all without looking over my shoulder. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.